Welcome to this emergency broadcasting message from WeThePeopleOfEarth.biz. Today, we want to discuss, we're not going to discuss today the subject of justice and peace on earth. This is November 2012. Rockets have just hit Israel. There's possible violence. There's violence breaking out all over the Middle East right now. But today, I'd like to discuss the context of the broader story towards, the ultimate story is, are we going to achieve an Armageddon or a new apocalypse and a better world for our future of justice and peace on earth? And today, I'd like to discuss capitalism in America. Now, the first time I issued emergency broadcasting messages was back in 2005. Capitalism in America was basically the same back then, but some of the fractures that I identified back then have been much more exposed today. And, the fundamental problem is this dynamic of business and government. But the problem is, what does capital work for? Who works? How does capital influence the world and the enterprise of the United States? And what we have is, we have a situation where, if you took the Republican view, they say, big government is not the solution. I would tend to agree with that. However, ignoring the needs of what we need to do that aren't done by anything but big government, then that's not the solution either. The Democrats rightfully recognize that there are certain social interests that, ultimately, in a democracy, people that get starving, will vote out the people that starve them. I'm not saying that's what's happening in America. We're facing, whether America is on a growth or not, whether we're facing a fiscal cliff and a recession. Actually, that's not even the bigger question, because the bigger question facing America is the question facing all of the world. Because what is obvious back in 2005 is obvious today. Back in 2005, we were enjoying a prosperity boom. I would argue, and one could easily prove it today, that it was debt financed all over the world, from Europe to China to United States. And, a debt financed prosperity boom is an illusionary bloom. And an illusionary bloom or a boom turns into a bubble, and bubbles bust. And when bubbles bust, things happen. And then when things happen, what happens? This is the ultimate problem in the story of us. Because let's talk about the ultimate part of the bubble that was exposed during 2008. And that was that we have this institution called banks. But these banks basically lend out illusionary money that's not even there. They lend out money from the Federal Reserve that basically just backs the money that the banks lend out. But the banks themselves have no more than 8%. Let's say they have the housing market. The banks have 8%. So if the markets start going down, ultimately the last holder of last resource is the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve owns all the houses that are collapsing, what does that mean? They own all the mortgages, but nobody's, then people are, if the economy starts collapsing, nobody starts paying the mortgages and it gets worse. Now, we've sort of shuffled that out to Buffalo and kept it we know how to incrementally make ourselves think we're not going down the toilet. But over time, we are. But we have time. But let's get to the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is, what happens when the Federal Reserve fails? well, you could argue with it. Okay, all the United States taxpayers are on the hook. But who are they on the hook for? Well, and then we got the debt issues too. But who are we on the hook for? Well, it's the dollar. Well, what's the choice and the difference? What's the solution? What's the dollar? Well, you know what? Because everything we own, our mutual funds, our pension funds, everything's denominated in dollars. Dollars can't go to zero, even if they're worthless. But anyway, that's a side point anyway. Let's talk about how capital is allocated and how it's changed over the last few years, because it's important. Okay, first thing is, like, if you looked at America and who owns America, think about the distribution of wealth. The typical homeowner, well, they, at the let's say the middle and lower income have that like housing equity, right? And that's, well, that got wiped out, unfortunately. Some of them have like 401ks and some of them have pensions, but companies don't want to give pensions anymore because they don't want guaranteed benefits. They'd rather stick you in 401ks and mutual funds. But those funds are only as good as the future expectations of the stocks they buy or the securities of the bonds they buy. But those are all connected to the fate of our own economy. And, well, the basic premise and problem is that the mutual funds and pension funds have very little exercise. They pretty much are rubber stamps to the board of directors. And I'm not saying that the board of directors and the management of the companies are doing wrong. They're basically doing right. But what is right for a manager of a company? They are paid to promote the bottom line. They're paid to promote their profits. Now, they can certainly take into account certain political interests and that type of thing, but for a company, if it's far cheaper to have something built offshore in China, then they owe it to their shareholders to do that. Well, okay, so so there are ramifications, because then all of a sudden the jobs are moving out of America, and well, now all of a sudden there are larger consequences to the society of the United States that, well, that mover of capital decides, well, on his own is the right thing to do and is the right within the company, but in the larger enterprise, is it right? And it still may be right. I'm not arguing that, actually. But here's the point I would make here. We also have lots of competing interests, and they're often competing, and we have solutions if we had a broader strategy. If instead of a big government, is that if we had an enterprise that was able to consolidate and buy the basic global enterprises, the GEs, the Caterpillars, the enterprises that make up our nations, the Verizons, the AT&Ts even, all of them. And, well, it could be just a passive ownership, but the point is this, is that we could start to imagine bringing down the federal government and turning over government things to this enterprise. An enterprise not like dedicated to bringing the profit to one group of people to another, well, but sort of a more benevolent enterprise designed to fill in the holes that our various enterprises don't fill in terms of what they try to with taxing and government. But see, taxing and government means that we're stuck with running the world by politics. And politics is no way to run a business, including the business of the United States. Now, we're not going to eliminate politics entirely, but if the United States had a business council, if that business council was able to exercise power by virtue of its ownership of funds, and, well, let's say that the owners of those funds, see, let's talk about this. Like, everybody now has funds in all these stocks. If we created a new enterprise, it could create its own stocks, its own bonds if we needed it, but I believe in a different kind of a thing, which is a separate part of the strategy. And, well, and that enterprise could then, merge all the other stocks, and then we could say, okay, we don't care about the individual stocks in our portfolio. What we care about is restructuring, like Wall Street 999, restructuring our entire enterprise to make it more efficient, more effective, but take account for all the people and the transitions that are required, and to create a broader basis of wealth throughout everybody in the United States. And that's where it gets a little more complicated. And actually, I don't have all the answers. And I have postulated before that it might be perfectly possible, and in fact, almost inherently true, that if we put our heads together, we could achieve all those answers. The other thing that is sort of an intellectual event horizon, and that is the possibility of like super intelligence, where all intelligence connected together with the intelligence of a computer could remodel, restructure, recalculate the whole entire system of our economic planet, and it's also how we do politics and orders. Like, for example, in my order, in my vision of this council, of this enterprise, well, people would vote their shares, and you could vote your shares, and what would you do? Well, the people in the businesses would report to the board members of the enterprise, and those board members, you could move around your shares or spread it among the people if you weren't happy with their actions. Now let me talk about two more things. How would you change the structure to eliminate this notion? You see, this is the problem. Basically, we have a situation where we have all this debt covered by a Federal Reserve, backed by the United States, full of its own debt, that is a full faith and credit of the United States of America, which is the best full faith and credit you can get, which is sort of interesting because currency is all relative. The value of currency is relative. So I would argue that the thing that I propose could actually increase the value of a currency, although it might take some work. But the idea is simply this: why not restructure it so instead of the mortgages as we have today, that the Fed banks 50% of the value of your house in the bank. So rather than that being held as an owning, like an ownership, well, it would be held as an equity ownership of the bank in the Federal Reserve. So our money would be back in your house. You'd have the other part of the house, and actually you'd have total control of the house. The Federal Reserve, our money would just have a passive interest in your house. And so as the values went up, which we are going to have a plan to create, because that is a plan for creating it. Because if you reduce the amount it costs to buy the houses, here's the thing we can do. We can start to raise the interest rates a little bit so somebody gets a return on money again. And, well, and then we restructure the banking, because if we start buying all these enterprises out, we're not going to be Wall Street trading up and down stocks and bonds and derivatives, the weapons of mass destruction. We won't need that anymore. We'll basically have enterprises invested, and we'll have to figure out new ways of doing investment in startup and venture capital. That's all has to be part of the scheme, because we have to spur further innovations. But, well, we have to start investing in the future of the planet, and that is really a disinvestment in military, and that is one of the big problems facing America. Now, one could argue that the military of America needs to be so big. Does it need to be 10 times bigger than any other nation combined, or like as huge as it is? Well, I'm not going to argue that. I'm going to argue that the path towards that would be a path to justice and peace, and that should be a diplomatic mission, and the path towards that is, well, a religious awakening, that we all work for the same God, and that must take place in Jerusalem and thereabouts. But there's parts of the path, and that's simply this. This is part of the issue that America faces. The politics of the military-industrial complex are very strong because, well, any time we have things built for the military, they're being built at home. So we don't have to worry about jobs going from China as long as we're building more bombers here. And, well, the question is, how many do we need? How many should we need? That's really not even the question. Could we better invest in the future of people? And the answer, I believe, is yes, but we must create peace on earth, and that can't be in the context just of capitalism America. It must be in the context of capitalism throughout the world. And I call for a new global, and I have called for a new global monetary system led by the world. I would argue led by the Fed, and bring the world to unity under one currency with one free enterprise of earth, connecting all of our enterprises together. One that I call WeThePeopleOfEarth.biz. Thank you for listening. This has been a test, not a test, a message from WeThePeopleOfEarth.biz.